They're both back there. Beady, 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 boo.
I could text her. Oh.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. I am Pastor Dave.
I am Recovering Heretic Dan.
Welcome. This is our Live Q&A show. So here we are.
Yeah.
Hi, Dan.
Yeah. And our topic today is a good one, considering our first
Pre-audience.
Audience
If you
question,
sit through the
yeah.
audience, you get to get pre-questions.
That's right. That's right. Karen gave us the warm-up for the show. Today's topic is forgiveness.
Okay.
Because it kind of hits you over the head with all three readings.
Yes, all three readings are about it. They're all good readings, too, actually.
Yeah. They are, and they all approach forgiveness from a slightly different vantage.
Yes.
So let's talk narrow, and then we'll get big.
Okay.
So the narrow is, today Paul is talking about forgiving people who consider the Sabbath as a very holy day, and forgiving people who don't consider that it's just another day.
Yeah.
And he goes back and forth with basically what he's saying is what we now say, hey, you be you, and that's cool. And just acknowledge that everybody can just do their own thing.
Yeah.
And forgive them if it kind of grates on you.
Yeah.
Why does he say that first place? I guess I'm looking for context in his case.
Okay.
What's going on at the church that he's writing to that he's got to tell these people, just chill?
Yeah. Possibly the biggest debate in Paul's day in the church, like the number one, I mean, you think color of the carpet is bad in our churches today. Like, biggest debate was whether you're allowed to eat meat or not as a Christian.
Interesting. I mean, meat in general.
Yes, because almost all meat you bought was from the temple. So
okay, so it wasn't like a vegetarian,
not really
ethical thing.
Well, right. It's not like I don't like factory farming. It's like what happened is the temple would get an ox or a bull or a cow or a sheep or a goat or whatever, and they would sacrifice it to the gods. And then 1/3 would be given to the gods, and 1/3 would be given to the priests for their meal. And then 1/3 would be sold in the marketplace. And this is how the temples helped fund themselves.
Okay.
And so basically if you went out and bought steak that day, you were almost guaranteed that you were eating something that had been sacrificed to a pagan god.
Right.
So, and had been given in honor of a pagan god. So then the next question everybody had was, are we allowed to eat this stuff, at all, right? Because it's been dedicated to a pagan god, and we all know the first commandment, and what does that say, right? And so this was the biggest ethical issue, and Paul deals with it in many other letters too. It routinely comes up. It's what is the proper course of action here? And there are always two different parties. There's the one party that says you're not allowed to eat this meat. It's been sacrificed to a pagan god. It's which then pagan gods are probably demons. They're not really gods. They're probably demons. Don't touch it, right? We're supposed to keep away from these people. And then there was the other party that was like the gods aren't. They're just statues. They're not really real. It doesn't really matter. I can eat what I want. It's all God created it all anyway. I can eat what I want.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the context. And so Paul's always trying to get his people to sort out how to deal with this question ethically without saying this side's right, this side's wrong. And I actually think the lesson here is probably the heart of all Christian ethics, because Paul says, if you read the whole chapter in Romans 14, the conclusion he comes to is, On the technical merits of the issue, the people who don't think you don't think it's a problem because they aren't real are right. That's why he says the weak say they should only eat vegetables. It means the weak in conscience.
Okay.
That their conscience is afflicted by this, and so they feel like they need to do this. And whereas you people are strong in conscience, you don't got a problem with this. And Paul usually says something like, "I side with you people who don't think it's a huge issue."
Mm-hmm.
But then Paul says that is completely missing the point. Is what Paul always comes to next, because Paul says what you should be most concerned about is what does your neighbor need in order to be faithful. And if your neighbor is offended by you eating meat, if that scandalizes their faith, then it's your duty to not eat meat, because that's what they need to be faithful.
Yeah.
And that should be the heart of Christian ethics kind of period for all things, right? Like, what does my neighbor need to be faithful? Because I've got everything I need in Jesus. I can eat meat or not eat meat, whatever. But, and so you can update this for anything, right? So we always ask, what kind of music should we sing in worship, right? Mm-hmm. People are like, I don't like this music, or I like this music, And Paul would say, well, that entirely misses the whole point. And it misses the whole point because the question is actually, what does your neighbor need to be faithful? Does that make sense?
It does.
Mm-hmm.
But then it brings up the question to me of like, there are entire Christian denominations that are founded on just those types of disagreements, right down to music.
Yeah,
some
right.
denominations are like, no, we're
Right.
splitting away from you because music offends God.
Yeah. Well, so there are outer limits on this, like principle. If your neighbor says, I need you to commit murder for me to be faithful, like, no, thank you.
Yeah.
But right, there's a lot of our arguments that are foolish in this scheme, which is why I think it's the heart of, the ethical question is not what do I need or not what do I think is right, but what does my neighbor need to be faithful and hear the gospel,
Okay. And then we move from Paul to, let's go to the Old Testament reading.
Yeah.
Where we have one of those famous scenes, Joseph.
Yeah.
He's risen to power. He's had his Technicolor Dreamcoat,
We're at the end of the musical.
Yeah. So the brothers are there, and of course, Joseph is like number 2 next to the Pharaoh as far as power in Egypt goes.
Right.
And so they're cowering about what he might do. Because they sold him into slavery. They tried to kill him.
Right.
And he just exhibits that total, what we think of as the ultimate Christian ethos of total and complete forgiveness. He's like, yeah, you did that, but
right.
It was clearly part of a plan because look where I am now.
Yeah.
If you hadn't tried to kill me, I'd just still be some poor shepherd somewhere.
Right.
What does Joseph's story say? Is there anything beyond that, of that feeling that you're supposed to be totally forgiving and trust that everything was part of a plan?
Well, notice he only can say that at the end, right?
Yeah.
Like he doesn't say that.
While he's in the pit.
Right. This is not what he says while he's in the pit or while he's in prison, falsely accused by, Potiphar's wife, or, this is not what he says in the moment. Right. Yeah. This isn't even what he says when he meets his brothers for the first time, right? He does this complicated scheme to kind of make him wriggle a little bit.
Yeah.
And
that's true. He does get a little bit of...
Right. He gets a little bit of a knife in there a little bit, and so I think it's a perfectly valid thing to say, you intended this for evil. God wrapped it up into something larger and greater, but it's something that comes in later, right? It's something that comes in afterwards. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So with a little time and distance, he can forgive.
Yeah, and he can say, there was, or Paul says, all things work together for good, right? That's hard to say in the moment, but in retrospect, you can kind of say, there was something greater at stake here, right?
So what's the lesson for us? Is it to try to always have that perspective in the moment, or to forgive ourselves for for losing it in the moment, but having the wisdom to go back and reflect.
All of the above, I mean, yes. I think the main lesson is be open to that, God is moving in ways you can't really comprehend, even in the pit or in jail, or, there's this movement of God in those times, even then, right? It's not just when things are going great. It's, and be open to, part of forgiveness is being open to how God moves in the world, right?
So we're kind of in a Job moment here where bad things may be happening, but there's a point.
Well, there's a point, or just admit the limits of your own knowledge, it's not just that there's a point, in Job. It's that, God's actual thrust is, did you create the hippopotamus? It's kind of God's, do you know why I made this animal not buoyant in water, but, a 40-mile-an-hour killer? Do you know why I did all these things? It almost requires just admitting our own failures in a way, right?
And limitations.
Yeah.
Our knowledge is finite.
Yeah.
Steve, backing up a little bit to our first example with Paul, Steve's asking, and you mentioned that the point that Paul's making is it's not about you, it's about doing what your neighbor needs.
Right.
And Steve says, why is it on me what my neighbor thinks? Why is it my responsibility?
Because, well, as a Christian, because you have all you need, you're supposed to be outwardly focused toward your neighbor, right? Luther says that sin is a lot like a bad back, is his illusion. And he says you're curved in on yourself. Your back is crooked, And he says sin kind of forces us to always be concerned with ourselves, and that the only way to growth and greater holiness is to stop that. And so grace because of grace, we have received all that we need, and that way we can kind of straighten up our backs. It's a divine back operation that then allows us to look at our neighbor and say, I don't have to keep looking at my own belly button. What do you need, Dan? So it's the growth in holiness, every day that allows us to, that is why we're motivated to be concerned with somebody other than us,
Yeah, I can see that. In our leadership classifications, that's one of the things we look at.
Right.
Is, are you inwardly motivated or are you outwardly motivated?
Yeah, I mean, there's a practical side to it, right, of what, we've all been part of the organization, whether it's big companies or little clubs that, the leaders, the whole thing seems oriented to just be a giant ego exercise for the leader, right? And it's there's a goal that, we're trying to motivate and we're trying to do, which is we don't need to act that way anymore. We can actually just be concerned with the other person because I have what I need.
That makes sense. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And just coincidentally, CEOs who have that outward view do tend to perform better long-term for their companies.
Right, because organizations that are just giant, ego trips for people aren't actually good.
Right.
They suck.
But they happen.
Yes.
All right, so let's move then to the third reading. And this is where we get Jesus. And what I find interesting is Jesus seems a little more of what we stereotype as the Old Testament smitey attitude in this than Joseph in the Old Testament, here's the more forgive it all. I'm totally at one with the universe.
Right.
Yeah, Jesus, this is the example, the parable with the king and the slave who's in massive debt to him.
Yeah.